is going to be episode 2 of the Cyber for All series, a series where I'm breaking down cybersecurity and privacy to be accessible for everyone. Last week we covered threat modeling, and I highly recommend going back and watching that episode to really get a solid grasp on this one. I explained in my first episode this is going to be a totally free course being funded by the awesome people donating to my Patreon. So let's assume you watched the last episode. Seriously, go watch it. So you know what a threat model is. A threat model is the narrow box surrounding all of the things you need to worry about at night and none of the things that you shouldn't. We talked about Joetopia, Joe Incorporated, and you, the average Joe. We discussed how the average Joe doesn't need to worry about all of the different things that Joetopia and Joe Incorporated have to worry about. Now we're going to talk about what you have to worry about. Sounds fun, right? This is the episode that may keep you up at night, but that's okay. This is the important episode that tells you about the threats, while the rest of the series will explain how to combat those threats. Sorry, but you're just going to have to worry from this episode until the next one. So let's start by talking about why you should worry about anything at all, and then we'll talk about what you have to worry about. Hacks cost companies over $400 billion a year. Obviously, they're not taking $400 billion from your bank account, but a pretty big chunk of this number is banks having to cover the money that's stolen from individuals' bank accounts, paying for cybersecurity insurance, the cost of which trickles down to the customer, and other costs that directly impact the average Joe, like identity theft and fraud. The money is real, but so is the physical threat. Hackers aren't just fat dudes in hoodies. They're abusive exes, stalkers, and creeps you met online. They use technology to extend their abusive behavior to the digital world. Stalkerware is a multi-million-dollar business with quote-unquote legitimate companies selling tracking and surveillance software to be installed on computers and phones under the guise of keeping kids safe, while those same companies acknowledge that the primary use of stalkerware is to facilitate abusive stalking behavior. Stalkerware allows for GPS tracking, text reading, and even camera and microphone access for abusive exes, fanboys, and other creeps. And it's upsettingly popular. Finally, we have the worst of them all. Worse than cyber criminals and online stalkers? I'd like to argue so. Worst of all are the massive private companies you know and love. The big data industry, made up of huge tech companies with budgets that rival those of developed nations, are tricking you into giving away your most intimate details, while using your data to manipulate your behavior before selling it off to the next guy for a premium. Surveillance companies, search engines, and social media sites make up the lion's share of offenders here, all vying for your personal information so that they can influence your purchase tendencies and even your vote. Why should you care? Your privacy, financial well-being, and personal security could be at risk. Now, I'm not going to try to scare you into watching the rest of this course. That's a common tactic. My intent here is to inform you about real scenarios and how they apply to you. I want you to walk away from this course informed, not scared. Equipped and empowered, not terrified and paranoid. So when I say here's what you should worry about, I mean that you should pay attention to these specific threats and follow along to figure out how you can combat them. So let's start. Let's set the scene. You're the average Joe. You have a wife and 2.5 kids. A normal 401k, and a dream to open up a lasagna parlor, remember? You don't have millions to spend on defense, nor do you have the special secret sauce that military and intelligence agencies will be gunning for. You just mow lawns for a living. What could you possibly have to worry about? Well, like I said before, the big one is the cyber criminal. Cyber criminals make billions of dollars a year, and a sizable chunk of that money is going after the little guy. There are a couple of notable ways they hurt the average Joe, and I'll talk about them each individually now and more in depth later. The big ones are fraud and ransomware. Now, as a side note, I'm using fraud as a bucket to include the capture, sale, and use of someone else's information for personal and financial gain. There are many ways to go about fraud in the cyber domain, but I'll go over a couple of the big ones here. The first is to attack the watering hole. If you're a bloodthirsty lion and you're hungry, you want to look for a juicy zebra. The zebra could be anywhere though, and they may be looking out for you. Your best bet is to go where the zebra will be, and to make sure that that place is somewhere the zebra will be distracted or feel safe, like a watering hole. Where's the safest place you know of to use and store your financial information? That would be banks. Cyber criminals target banks because they know that that's where the zebras will be, and that's where the zebras will feel safe. You're going to give your bank your financial information, the zebra, because you feel safe there. So that's just where criminals will target. Banks have been the target for robbery for a long time now, because that's where the money is. The money is still there, but the nature of the robbery has changed. Criminals target banks for the same reason they target grocery stores, e-commerce sites, and other big players in the financial realm. That's where the money is. If you show me any place that collects a lot of financial information, I'll show you a place that's targeted by cyber criminals. These criminals will outright hack these companies and steal the hopefully encrypted data from where it's stored. Think breaking into the bank vault, but instead of money, gold, and jewels, it's the passwords, bank card numbers, and PINs. They'll then take that information and sell it in batches to other criminals, who will break those batches into batches and sell those, and the wholesale market repeats itself until eventually some guy a world away goes up to an ATM and drains your bank account. The problem is, the guy who takes your money is rarely the same guy who stole your identity. It can be days, weeks, months, or longer between the hack and your bank account being drained, making it harder and harder to catch the bank robbers. Another way they steal information is by installing little devices inside of card readers called skimmers. What these devices do is scan information off of your card, store the data, and pass it on to whatever vending machine, gas pump, ATM, or point of sale system you are using, leaving you none the wiser. This requires physical access to the machine, so it's a bit more rare, but it still happens. The last method we'll cover is similar to the card skimmer. It's called point of sale malware, or POS malware. It's like any other computer virus, except it's built specifically for point of sale systems. It stores all of the data for every transaction made by the point of sale system and sends it back to the bad guys. It's a pretty nasty method of stealing a lot of data at once, and it's been used to cost companies and consumers millions of dollars in the last couple of years. The data from skimmers and point-of-sale malware goes through the same process. It's aggregated in big batches, separated and sold in bulk, where it's sold as many times as necessary before eventually, well on down the line, being used to drain your bank account and savings dry. Fraud is a multi-million-dollar industry, and it's one of the most direct and common ways that cybercriminals can hurt you. Then there's ransomware. Think of a real-world kidnapper. They steal someone off the street and offer the innocent safe return in exchange for some sort of ransom. There's some serious risk here, wherein the kidnapper has to put themselves in harm's way during the kidnapping, the ransom process, and the innocent's delivery. It's incredibly risky. So, hackers did what hackers do and created software that takes hostages for them at a huge scale. Instead of yanking someone off the street and contacting the family for extortion, they quote-unquote steal your data and hold it hostage. Ransomware uses encryption, or read simply just fancy math, to make all of your files inaccessible. You can't read your notes, you can't open your email, and you can't access your bank account or family photos until you pay the ransom. The payment is usually facilitated by cryptocurrency, which allows victims to pay the kidnappers without figuring out the hackers' identities. It's not just less risky, it's scalable. One kidnapper could only handle a couple of kidnappings, but a ransomware attacker could hold millions of computers hostage. It does affect millions of people a year, and can cost serious money for the average Joe. Ransomware can be delivered via email, infected websites, and social media messages, making it very easy to be infected. Cybercriminals take up the lion's share of threats faced by the average Joe. On top of fraud and ransomware, there is sextortion, wherein criminals convince victims that they have sexually explicit material belonging to the victim, and will release it only if they don't pay up. Click farming that uses your computer to click on ads, which generates income for the attackers, and botnets that turn your computer into a zombie to be used in attacks on other websites. But let's move on. Stalkerware is unfortunately a threat faced by the average Joe that very few are currently talking about. There has been very little discussion recently about the booming stalkerware industry and how dangerous it is for victims of domestic abuse, stalking, and sextortion. Stalkerware is malware built specifically for the purpose of stalking the victim, giving the attacker the ability to track the victim's real location, read their emails and text messages, and even listen in to their phone call. It's an unfortunate digital extension of an age-old threat. It's very real, often with a very serious overlap into the real world. Last but not least, we have your favorite private companies. The Facebooks and the Googles, your email and internet service providers, they are the threats faced by the individual that break the mold of what I've told you before. In the last video, I told you that threats are the actors that have the intention and the capability to do you harm, while the harm is the impact and the likelihood of the attack taking place. Generally speaking, the average Joe needs to worry about low capability actors, with relatively low impact, relatively speaking. If the average Joe gets owned, the lights don't go out for millions of people and nations don't go to war. Private companies are the exception. Private companies have budgets that rival many governments and militaries, minds more brilliant than most stagnant government salaries can attract, and financial incentives that motivate their intent to do extreme harm, even and especially to the average Joe. Many people in my space and others believe that privacy and security are two separate circles, but as the case of stalkerware shows, privacy has a massive impact on security and vice versa. While stalkerware has a profound impact on the privacy and security of individuals, the privacy impact of companies has a massive impact on millions of people. Its impact at scale. That's the worst part of this story. The difference in capability between the average Joe and the adversaries they face is insignificant in most of the cases that we just mentioned. It's relatively easy for the average Joe to protect themselves from cyber criminals and stalkerware, from skimmers and ransomware. Protecting yourself from private companies, though, takes some serious work and sacrifice. That's why I've devoted a large part of the curriculum to privacy and private companies, and we'll throw some government surveillance tips in there as well. So there you have it. There's all of the boogeymen that should keep you up at night. Cyber criminals that take part in ransomware attacks, identity theft, and online bank robberies, stalkerware that allows a real-world attacker to track your movements and read your messages online, and private companies, the most formidable adversary faced by the average Joe. I can't stress it enough that this isn't an exhaustive list. When we get to the practical defense portion of the course, we'll talk about the adversaries mentioned here and others that the average Joe faces. This video was more meant as a primer, an introduction to the kinds of threats faced by the average Joe, threats we will start talking about in the next couple of videos. I hope this video helped narrow the box that is your threat model. It's tough to define the average threat faced by the average Joe, and I know that this video may do more to worry you than it does to help you. But if you stick around through the rest of the course, you'll know more about how to defend against all of the threats I've mentioned in this video and more. Thank you for the support, and a special thank you to my patrons. Take it easy.